All right, now let's move on to our authorate concepts here. And again, this is just an FYI type module. There's not going to be any exercises associated with it. Right now, we're just laying the foundation to make sure that we're all on the same page before we actually start using authorate. And in this module, what we're going to do is go over some very common concepts and terms that you'll want to be familiar with before we start actually using the authorate application. And one of the very first concepts that you should become familiar with is that of a library. All right, now I've used that word a couple times already. Now what that really means is a database. Authorate is supported by a back-end database, and you can really use the two terms synonymously if you wanted to, library and database. Now the database itself can come in two formats. It can either be a SQL Server database, or it can be what we refer to as a JET library. A JET library is nothing more than a fancy access database. And the student libraries that you'll use for training, those are just tiny little access databases. All right? The functionality inside of those databases is exactly the same no matter if you're in SQL or you're in JET. The difference is going to be the scalability and the overall robustness of that database. Always better to have your production environment be in a SQL database, because a SQL database can go up to something like 3 terabytes of data. If for some reason you ever got to that point, you could, whereas a JET library can only go up to about 2 gig of data before the access file basically becomes obsolete, and you'll start to encounter all sorts of database issues. There's also some reliability with going to a SQL Server database, and you can also have your IT administrator put that SQL Server database on a backup schedule. So very important to put your production library on a SQL database instead of using a JET library for your production environment. All right, now the authorate library. The word library, what we're referring to is the front-end component of the authorate application. You'll never actually see the database tables. You'll never have to perform queries inside of SQL Server or anything along those lines. When you use authorate, you log into the library, and that is the user-friendly front-end portion of authorate. All right, now that library is going to be the container for the majority of the content that all of your users will be working with inside of authorate. Now we say that it holds most but not all of the things that you need, because there's going to be some files that will always be external from the authorate database. As we go through the training, it's going to be more apparent what those files are, but just so you're aware, for example, when you publish a document from authorate, the book that you publish references an external publishing template, such as a Word template or a dot file, an HTML frame set file, or something along those lines. Those files are saved externally from the library. Also, depending on your graphics strategy and the way that your team uses graphics, your graphics may be saved externally from the authorate library. When we go over using graphics, you'll see that we have the option of saving graphics inside of the database, which is perfectly fine. But you can also save graphics outside of the database. So let's say you've got a common directory structure that you're using within your organization. You may want to keep those graphics external from the authorate database because perhaps non-authorate users are using those graphics and also updating and adding to those graphics. So it doesn't make sense for you to have them in the Author-it library. So for the most part, the majority of the content that your authors will be working with when they assemble their documentation will be in that database. However, your external publishing templates and perhaps your graphics may be located outside of that library. Alright, so we're asked many times, how many libraries do you need? The answer to that is one production library, or in other words, one production database. And the reason for that is because the collaborative features of Author-it don't work between multiple libraries. And it's very difficult to share content between those libraries. You can technically import and export content from one library to the other, but you're going to make your author's life very complicated if you have content strewn across multiple libraries. And again, we're here to set up the author's life to make it much easier and faster for them to create documentation. So why would you put those barriers in place for them to share content and also work collaboratively within the team? So again, that's one production library, hopefully on SQL Server. All right, and now if you want to maximize reuse and avoid duplication of content across multiple libraries, just only have that one production library. Now, we do have an exception to that rule for testing purposes. You can have a test version of your library. That test library can be on SQL. It can also be a JET library, completely up to you. What some companies like to do is periodically restore a backup copy of their production SQL database to a new test database. And the reason for that is, let's say you want to add on some additional functionality to Author-it that you haven't been using before. Let's say you decide you want to start exploring structured authoring or variants. All right, and what we don't recommend is you start exploring features inside of your production library, because again, that can lead to surprises, and we don't like surprises in our published output. But you can do some testing in that test version of your library to test out some new functionality that you may not be familiar with, or perhaps you want to design some new styles or templates and test out those styles and templates in a safe location. Well, we absolutely recommend that you do that in a sandbox library instead of your actual production library. All right, so we have a question here. When you talk about SQL Server database, are you talking about the Microsoft product and therefore Author-it doesn't work with Oracle? That is correct. Author-it is not compatible with Oracle databases at the moment. It is compatible with SQL Server databases, so the Microsoft SQL Server product. All right, so again, that's two options there. You can have a back-end SQL Server database, or you can have a JET database, which is just a physical access database file. All right, but your production environment should really be on a SQL database for various reasons: scalability, robustness, backup procedures, reliability, and so on.